Stephen O'Doherty is a leader in the Christian community of Australia who's done a lot of thinking about the Safe Schools Coalition and its education program called All of Us. He's the CEO of Christian Schools Australia, representing hundreds of schools around the nation. He's also a former journalist and was once the Shadow Education Minister for New South Wales. Stephen, thank you for joining me.
Claire, it's a pleasure.
Stephen, the Safe Schools Coalition was set up to make Australian schools safer and more inclusive for students who are same-sex attracted or living with gender diversity issues, basically to prevent homophobia and bullying. Do you think that's a good idea?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with those ambitions. Those are great ambitions. Everybody wants schools to be safe places for every student, and students that have same-sex attraction or who are bullied for whatever reason, they need to be safe at school. No contest about the ambitions.
The classroom teaching material that the Coalition has put together, the All of Us program, it aims to teach kids to be more understanding of LGBTI students and to be supportive friends or allies. What elements of the program do you like? Are there parts of it that you're supportive of?
It's very hard to support that particular program because the underlying worldview of the program is a worldview that we think just paints a wrong picture about human sexuality and gender and community and ways of dealing with those within a broader framework of human well-being or human flourishing. The underlying worldview is not one that we're very comfortable with.
Which parts of the material are you most concerned about?
One of the things that really worries us is that the material assumes a worldview where sexuality becomes the most important thing about a person. And there's a sense, if you look through the lesson material and the exercises that they ask kids to go through, there's a sense in which at a very early age, even before many kids are thinking about these issues, they want to almost encourage kids to think of themselves as identifying as one particular gender and one particular sexuality, and to lock that identity in. We just don't think human beings work that way. Students develop at different rates. Students need to develop their own identity, not just in sexuality, but in a whole range of areas, in community and in conjunction with their families. The problem with the program is that it tends to overlay one particular view of human well-being and elevates that above every other view, including especially the view that we are spiritual beings, that we have a relationship with God, that this relationship with God is the thing which, as Christians believe, is the most defining characteristic.
Can I just go back to where you talked about parts of the program that encourage students to think of themselves or identify themselves as being same-sex attracted? I looked at the program and I found one exercise that's handed out to students where it's more that they're encouraged to imagine what it would be like if they were coming out as gay or talking to their teacher or telling their friends on Facebook and so on. So to me, that seems to be teaching the kids simply to empathise.
Programs that encourage kids to empathise with the view of others are really important. Empathy is a very, very important aspect of human society. In fact, it was empathy that Christ showed to the people around him that really defined him from everybody else around who just wanted to judge. The religious leaders of the day just wanted to judge and condemn. You'd have to say that one of the most important characteristics of Jesus is his compassion. So to develop compassion in people is very important. Christians want to develop that compassion in kids in Christian schools. That's different, however, from saying to very young children, look, imagine you're gay. We want you to identify today as being gay. For that child, they may never have had that thought before. They may have never even imagined themselves as sexual beings because these exercises are being given to quite young students. If they are starting to develop a sense of their own sexuality, then that's something that they're going to be working through in conjunction with their family and their teachers and their peers. To overlay a program that then runs an experiment that says, today we identify you as being gay, you'll play the role of a gay person today, is a repeat of a discredited experiment called the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment. Now, back in the 1960s in the United States, after the dreadful race riots, there was a teacher who was so keen to make sure that her students did not suffer the racism of her community around her, that she decided on this controversial experiment. She came in one morning and said, right, today we're dividing the class into brown-eyed people and blue-eyed people. And then she did different things for those different groups in the way that black people and white people were segregated. She segregated her brown eyes and blue eyes students. And then later in the week, I think, or the next time, she swapped those groups around. The idea was to get them to empathise with being somebody who was oppressed. Now, the context was the race riots in America in the 1960s. Later on, psychologists who've studied that experiment, which has been used a lot, said that it's actually quite dangerous for the people who are asked to identify in these different groups. And for some of them, the psychological trauma that they endured for some time afterwards was deleterious and actually counteracted any good that was done by the experiment. Now, that's not me saying that. There are, there's a considerable body of psychological research that says brown eyes, blue eyes experiments are quite dangerous. Well, the All of Us program uses brown eyes, blue eyes type experiments, and we think for that reason alone, educators should reject the use of that material. So building compassion is great. Using discredited programs to do so, asking kids to identify as something that's beyond their experience is dangerous.
Kevin Donnelly, a senior researcher at the Australian Catholic University, has described the program in his view as social engineering. Now, just to play devil's advocate for a minute, some people might say that all education is social engineering of one kind or another, and that Christian schools have social agendas too. Would you agree?
All educators have a social agenda, of course they do. It's about creating healthy societies made up of strong individuals who understand who they are and who contribute to their own family and to others. That's what education is about. It's about economic and social development. But that agenda is informed by a worldview. So for Christian schools, the worldview is of a God who calls us to know him through his son Jesus. And it's about a God who has certain characteristics and who has particular things to say about what it is to be human. One of those things relates to sexuality being best expressed for our well-being, best expressed between a man and a woman in a marriage relationship, committed to each other under God for life. That's why for the church, marriage is such an important issue. In fact, it's a sacrament. The Safe Schools program has a different worldview. In their worldview, there's no God. In their worldview, or at least it doesn't assume a God. In their worldview, sexuality does not relate to our biology, but sexuality relates to the way we feel. And a lot of their exercises are to do with promoting this idea of fluid gender. Now, I have absolutely no problem. In fact, I wrote a report for the government in the 1990s in New South Wales saying that one of the things that we were doing that was damaging our boys and girls was saying if you're biologically a boy, you need to look like a state of origin rugby player. And if you're biologically a girl, you need to look like, a ballet dancer or whatever. These are gender stereotypes that are really unhelpful. Because we all live in different places. Boys are artistic. Girls like to play sports and do outdoor activities. If we condemn or judge people based on their behaviours, we have completely lost sight of the gospel message, which is God made everybody in his image. Everybody is worthy. Everybody is to be respected. We need to have compassion for everybody. But gender characteristics do not equate to sexuality, in my view, and I think in the view of the mainstream church. And the problem with the program is that its worldview seems to be saying you can choose your gender, you can choose your sexuality, and you are the king of the universe. You don't have to account to anybody else, including, and I'd add in brackets especially God. So that's the difference in worldview. That means that we just have a fundamental disagreement with the underlying assumptions behind the program.
Okay, it looks like public schools in Victoria will have to sign up to the Safe Schools program by the end of 2018. So far it's not compulsory in other states. What about Christian schools? It's not being pushed on Christian schools at the moment. What are your expectations for the future?
Well, schools generally, independent schools generally, have been very cautious about any government imposing any ideology. In fact, government schools should also be very cautious about any government imposing any ideology. I can remember a few years ago schools were rightly up in arms about Brendan Nelson, who was the then Liberal Education Minister, insisting that as a condition of funding they had to have an Anzac poster on the wall that had a set of Australian values and a picture of Simpson and his donkey. Now you might say, well, what was wrong with that? They were great values. Yes, they were. But the idea that later on a government would come and use that principle as a precedent to put another set of values on the wall that promoted an ideology that most Australians did not accept, that idea is a dangerous idea. So for that reason, throughout the history of Australia, educators have tended to leave curriculum and ideology to the governments have left that to the educators, and governments have provided general guidelines about values and about beliefs and curriculum outcomes, but they've fallen short of telling schools what to think. What's wrong with what the Andrews government in Victoria is doing at the moment is that it's using the power of its political power and its funding power to enforce an ideology on schools that surpasses the teacher in the classroom and, very importantly, the parent at home. Australia's education system under the Melbourne Declaration, which is, if you like, the vision statement, the mission statement of all Australian governments, signed up to by the Ministers of Education a few years ago, that specifically says that education is a partnership between governments and the whole community, including parents and churches and those things. It says that an outcome of education is the spiritual and emotional development of kids. If the Andrews government insists on one version only of a sexuality agenda, then it's completely cut out of the picture, this partnership approach. And it wouldn't matter if they were promoting green apples over red apples. You know, the idea that a government will mandate something in this area is a very dangerous idea.
I want to talk about some of the statistics. Research is showing that 75% of students who identify as LGBTI experience bullying, and most of that bullying is happening at school. And many of these young people, as we know, are suffering mental health issues and committing suicide as a result. How does that make you feel personally as someone with thousands of young people directly in your care?
It concerns me greatly that any student is bullied. It's not only students who are LGBTI who are bullied, but they are bullied in a particular way which is particularly distressing. By the way, students who don't identify as LGBTI are also subject to gender-based and sexuality-based bullying and harassment. It just seems a truism that as kids grow up, one of the things they will use to bully other kids relates to human development. And at a time when hormones are coursing through their body and they're developing their own sexuality and they're living in a kind of a gender soup that they're absorbing from the media every single day, no wonder kids are struggling to come to terms with that. And no wonder that becomes an aspect of fun, bullying, joking, whatever in the playground. It's completely unacceptable in all its forms.
Do you have parents and principals coming to you as the CEO of Christian Schools Australia who have students in their school identifying as gay or gender diverse?
It won't surprise you to know that these are issues that every school deals with, including, of course, Christian schools. And principals come to us asking for advice or to tell the story about what's happening in their own schools. Christian schools deal with compassion. With students who have same-sex attraction, students who are dealing with different types of gender issues, including students who have medical reasons that indeed create a situation for them that most of us just can't understand or describe.
It's not hard to find stories about Christian schools in Australia that have been quite unwelcoming, unaccepting of students, even hostile at times, of students who are dealing with gender issues and sexuality issues. What sort of an environment would you like Christian schools in Australia to become towards these young people?
Look, the great desire of Christian schools, particularly the principals that I've spoken to, all of them want to be able to deal with every child and their pastoral needs, their spiritual needs, their social needs, alongside of their education at school. That's what Christian schools are all about. It's the development of the whole child. And the whole child means everything that's going on for that child in their world. So principals want to compassionately deal with every need that a child has. And that's the framework that Christian schools bring to this question. It's meeting the child at their point of need, just as Jesus did, and being able to walk with them and help them to work through those issues in conjunction with the living God.
There's been cases in the media where students have been kicked out of school formals or not allowed to bring their same-sex partner along, and some of these complicated issues that principals are having to deal with. What would you say to those principals who've dealt with the issues in perhaps not the wisest way? Have you been in a position to advise them or to correct, or how do you handle that as the CEO of your organisation?
I think it's quite true that in recent years in particular, and as this issue has got more airing, and as groups such as the Safe Schools Coalition have raised it in the public forum, and I have no problem with that. We need to discuss these issues as a community, and Christians need to respond to them in a mature way. So as that has become more prevalent in our society, schools have found themselves sometimes at the point of conflict with students and their parents, and often it's around that Year 12 formal. Now, some schools have a rule, by the way, that says nobody brings partners to the formal, and that's a way of ensuring that kids who don't have partners don't feel left out, that they're not bullied by others for not having partners. Some schools have a policy that you bring anybody you choose, just a friend, a special friend, whether or not you're a couple. And again, that makes sure that those people who aren't coupled up at that stage don't feel embarrassed. And other schools say, well, yes, bring your special partner. And sometimes same-sex students will seek to bring their same-sex partner to the formal. Now, schools respond to that in different ways. It does represent, for many of them, a challenge to the conservative nature of the school community. That's got to be said. It's just a truism. And schools are learning how to deal with that as more and more students want to challenge or want to express themselves in that way. What we ask students to do, and our advice to schools is always to say, look, don't make it a political issue. Don't, placard, don't barricade, don't come dressed in something that's so outlandish that what you've done is elevated your sexuality above other aspects of your personality. We also, from time to time, face claims that students have been expelled because of their sexuality. In every case that I've examined, that's simply not been true. Where students have left a Christian school because, in their mind, they have come out as a gay student, it's been the case that the student was acting out in that school in a way that put them into conflict with the school's discipline and other policies. Because schools need to be a place where everybody can feel safe. And sometimes you find that activists make other students feel unsafe and also defy the right of the school, for instance, to determine a certain uniform policy or a certain behaviour policy, or indeed to teach a certain view of sexuality. Christian schools do teach a certain view about marriage. They do teach a biblical view about sexuality and human relationships. And there's plenty of room for debate. Christians themselves, all Christians, mature Christians, will debate this issue until Christ returns. But within the confines of a school, there need to be some rules about how that debate is engaged in and how we treat each other with respect within the school community. And in every case that I've investigated, it's been a challenge to the authority of the school that's been the issue, rather than the student's sexuality.
What is the Christian school community currently doing in Australia to tackle this issue of making schools safer? We've just talked about school formals, but are there some other programs that are being put in place?
Well, look, the first thing to be said is that all Christian schools, and you'd hope that all schools in Australia, but all Christian schools that I'm aware of, the safety of students, the emotional, physical, educational, social safety of students. These are their primary concerns because, after all, we're pastoral communities that care for people as being children of God, given dignity by the very fact that God made them in his image. However they present, whatever they like to do, whatever they identify with, they are in the image of God. And when that central point is the dominating worldview of the philosophy of your school, every aspect of the school works to ensure that the school is a safe environment. The idea that you have to bring in a specialised program to make a school a safe school is sort of anathema to that whole idea that schools start out from the premise that as communities of Christ, we're safe by nature. Look, it's interesting, isn't it, that as these issues become more prominent, we do have more people raising the issue within the general community, and Christian schools are no exception to that. And principals are wondering how best to respond to that in a manner that befits their ministry as a ministry of Christ, a community of Christians working together in the interests of these kids. We called together a symposium recently that had about 80 or 90 educators and some experts such as Stephen Stathis from Queensland. He's a paediatric psychiatrist. It was entirely illuminating for all of us to hear Stephen Stathis speak about, firstly, gender dysphoria. These kids who are born with, in some cases, mixed genitals, or kids who are born with other genetic issues that mean for them, boy, girl, gender issues, sexuality, it's not a straightforward matter. Now, you've just got to receive that information, and when you hear that the numbers, according to medical science, might be 15 in 1,000, most of the principals in the room on that day said, well, hang on a minute, we've got 1,000 kids in our school. Do you mean 15 of them have some sort of medical reason for being confused about their sexuality as their gender emerges during puberty? And the answer they were given was, yes, that's true. The universal response is that we need to understand more about what's going on here so that we can compassionately deal with these kids at their point of need. That's the desire of every school principal, certainly in Christian schools, and I've got no doubt in every school around the country. Then there are the group of children for whom it's not a straightforward matter as they identify somewhere on that gender spectrum, and everybody going through puberty understands what that period of time is like. To judge kids on the basis of decisions they're making at that time, particularly to condemn them or to reach out and throw up the big hammer of judgment at them, is the most unkind thing, the most unhelpful thing that we could possibly do. And educators who are at this symposium, and every educator I've spoken to, wants to compassionately deal with these kids at their point of need, with every child, but with kids who are developing. There's a recognition there that we've got to meet them at their point of need and walk with them on whatever journey they're being taken on.
Now, you're not a theologian, Stephen, but as a man of faith, how do you believe that Jesus would respond to students who are intersex or questioning their gender or have come out as gay?
Sometimes the whole question about sexuality is misunderstood. It's just one of a number of issues that any of us deal with at any time. It's probably true to say that the Christian community focuses on this issue to the exclusion of others that we should be focusing on. I'm not sure that sexuality is the most important thing about a person. I think where they stand before Christ is the most important thing about a person. And if that person elevates their sexuality or some other behaviour or some other aspect of their character above their relationship with God, then to my mind that's getting things in the wrong order. What we ought to be doing is, and what Jesus would do, would be, I think, just to ask them about their relationship with God. How do you stand before God? How do you, how are you with your fellow man? Remember, Jesus condemned the most religious, the most pious, the most legalistic people of his day. He condemned them while he elevated people who, in the eyes of the world, were unlovable, unlovely. The people with disabilities, the woman at the well who had multiple husbands, the unlovely of society, the outcasts. These were the ones that he first sought out. And why did he seek them out? Because he had pity on them? Absolutely not. He sought them out because as children of God, they had dignity and worth, and he wanted them to understand how much he loved them as God's son, and how much God wanted them to know that they were loved. He wanted to restore their relationship with God the Father. This wasn't an act of pity, this was an act of identification and compassion. And if Jesus were here, he would be identifying and compassionately being with the very people that often the Christian church condemns. We should be like him.
Do you think sometimes the Christian community needs to understand or take on board that difference is not necessarily wrong?
Difference, the church too often, and not just the church, the whole of society, by the way, but the church, as it represents some of the best and worst of society, to condemn people because of their difference is exactly the wrong thing to do. It's exactly the thing that will prevent people from coming to know Jesus as their Saviour. It's not the way of Christ to condemn difference as wrong. Christ reached out to the different. Christ identified with the different. Christ said, I am with you in your difference. But the most important thing that we all need to know about is that through Christ we can be restored in our relationship to God. Now, it's not just the church that condemns difference. In our society, it's now become fashionable to condemn any Christian as being a bigot. I mean, where did that come from? The self-same people who are demanding that the Christian church reach out compassionately and stop judging people who have different characteristics, whether they be sexuality, gender, or whatever else. Those same people who stand up for the right of others to have equality are the very ones who are condemning Christians, believers, as bigots and homophobes. They stand condemned by their own language. They are being just as bigoted and Christophobic, to coin a phrase, as the Christians are being accused of being. We all need to find a way to relate to each other and have a mature discussion, not this finger-waving, arm-throwing, name-calling rubbish that goes on. That doesn't help anybody, and in particular it doesn't help kids in schools. The child who is same-sex attracted in any school, who's being bullied, who sees a gay activist going hammer and tongs with some theologian on the television, how does that help them? That's exactly the sort of behaviour that will lead them to question their own identity and will put them onto a downward spiral that may indeed end in self-harm. The way we conduct this debate is one of the most important things we can possibly do for these kids.
There's been a lot of reaction and fear, particularly among parents, especially parents of faith, about the Safe Schools Coalition and the All of Us program. And it's not always been based on facts. So what would you say to parents who are watching this, and how would you encourage them to respond in their community about this issue?
Well, if I was in Victoria, I'd be very worried. And if I was in a state where they've not yet adopted the changes that the Commonwealth Government has said need to be made to the Safe Schools program, I'd be worried. Because I think the federal government got it right. I think the changes that they've made are sensible. They've asked for those particular exercises that would do potentially the most damage. They've asked for them to be removed. Any parent should ask any school, and this is not only their right but their obligation, what are my children going to be taught in the area of sexuality, gender? What ideology lies behind that? What's the worldview of the people who've put the program together? Can I see what material the kids are going to be exposed to? These are sensible questions that every parent must answer. These issues are issues primarily firstly for parents to discuss with their kids, and secondly for the parents' community of faith, if they've chosen one, to discuss with the kids. Whether that's the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, the Jewish faith, whatever it may be, Australia recognises the importance of the spiritual development of children. We're a signatory to the United Nations covenants, by the way, that say children have the absolute right to be brought up in the faith community of their parents and for that to be reflected in their education, should they choose. So these are big global issues. This is not just something that, the Victorian government or someone in the Safe Schools Coalition can override with impunity. Parents need to ask questions. They have the responsibility and the obligation to do so. They have the right to do so. And if they don't like the answers they get from the school, they need to talk to the school about that, and then they'll make a choice about whether they ask for the child to be excluded from those lessons, which is never actually a good look. It actually makes the child a target. Or they may want to choose a school that's more in keeping with their family's values.
Okay. Thanks very much for your time, Stephen.
Thank you.